The gunshot split the evening air as Margaret Price aimed her revolver at the dusty horizon where the last outlaw had disappeared, her breathing ragged and her hands shaking with the realization that she'd once again been left to fend for herself and her children. The year was 1878, and the unforgiving plains of the Oklahoma Territory had claimed yet another man who'd promised her the world and delivered nothing but heartache and an orphan child. "Mama," a small voice called from inside the weathered cabin. "Is he gone?" Margaret lowered the gun, tucking it into the folds of her skirt as she turned back toward the cabin where her 4 children huddled together, watching her with wide, frightened eyes. "Yes, Eleanor, he's gone." 10-year-old Eleanor, her eldest, stood protectively in front of her siblings, 8-year-old James, 5-year-old Charlotte, and 2-year-old Thomas. 4 children with 4 different fathers, all of whom had either abandoned her or died, leaving her alone in the vast emptiness of the frontier. Margaret swallowed hard, pushing aside the grief that threatened to overwhelm her. Samuel, Thomas's father, had been different. She'd thought he might stay. But 3 weeks ago, a gang of outlaws had ambushed him during a supply run to town. Today had been the first time she'd seen any of those men again, and she'd made certain he wouldn't return. "Is he coming back?" James asked, his dark eyes so like his father's, full of uncertainty. "No," Margaret replied firmly, climbing the 3 wooden steps to the porch. "He won't be coming back. None of them will." Charlotte reached for her mother's hand. "Are we safe now?" Margaret gathered her youngest son into her arms, feeling his small body trembling against her chest. "We're safe," she promised, though the words felt hollow. In truth, she didn't know how they would survive another winter. The small patch of land she'd claimed on the outskirts of newly established Tulsa was hardly enough to sustain them, and she was running out of options. "We need to pack," she said firmly, setting Thomas down. "We leave at first light." "Where are we going?" Eleanor asked, her young face already carrying the worry of someone much older. Margaret touched her daughter's cheek. "To town. We need supplies and I need to find work. Real work this time." The children nodded, accustomed to upheaval, to starting over. It broke Margaret's heart to see how readily they accepted another change, how quickly they moved to gather their few possessions without complaint. As night fell across the plains, Margaret sat on the porch, rifle across her lap, watching the moonlight cast long shadows across the land that had promised so much and given so little. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, at least, her children were safe. The journey into Tulsa took most of the morning, the wagon creaking under the weight of their meager belongings. The town had grown considerably in the 3 months since Margaret had last visited. New buildings lined the main street, and the constant hammering of construction filled the air. The railroad was coming, bringing with it the promise of prosperity and more people. Margaret guided the wagon toward the general store, her stomach knotting with anxiety. The storekeeper, Mr. Peterson, had always been kind to her, but charity only stretched so far and her credit was likely exhausted. "Wait here," she instructed the children as she climbed down from the wagon. "Eleanor, watch your brothers and sister." The bell above the door jingled as Margaret entered the store, immediately enveloped by the familiar scent of coffee, leather, and dried goods. Mr. Peterson glanced up from behind the counter, recognition flickering across his weathered face. "Mrs. Price," he greeted her, his voice carefully neutral. "Mr. Peterson." Margaret approached the counter, chin held high despite her worn dress and dusty appearance. "I've come to settle my account and purchase supplies." The older man's eyebrows rose. "Settle your account? That's unexpected, Mrs. Price. It's been mounting for some time." Margaret placed a small leather pouch on the counter. The coins inside, all she had left from Samuel's pockets, clinked softly. This should cover what I owe, and I need work, Mr. Peterson. Anything you might have." The storekeeper eyed the pouch, then Margaret, his expression softening slightly. "I don't have work for you here, Mrs. Price, but—" He hesitated. "The new hotel is hiring, and the saloon's always looking for help." Margaret stiffened. "I won't work in a saloon." "Didn't think you would," Mr. Peterson replied with a nod. "Hotel it is, then. Owner's name is Walter Ingram. New to these parts, but seems decent enough. Buildings at the end of the street, can't miss it." Margaret thanked him, purchased the essential supplies they needed, and returned to the wagon, where 4 anxious faces watched her expectantly. "We're going to find a place to stay," she told them, forcing a confidence she didn't feel into her voice. "And Mama's going to find work." The Tulsa Hotel was an impressive 3-story structure, the largest building in town. Its freshly painted facade and glass windows spoke of ambition and wealth, 2 things Margaret had learned not to trust. She secured the wagon at the hitching post and helped the children down, straightening their clothes and wiping dust from their faces. "Best behavior," she reminded them quietly. "Remember your manners." The hotel lobby was cool and dim after the bright sunshine outside. A polished wooden desk dominated the space, behind which stood a tall man with broad shoulders and a neatly trimmed beard. He looked up as they entered, his blue eyes sweeping over Margaret and the 4 children trailing behind her. "Can I help you?" His voice was deep, with an accent she couldn't quite place, not Southern but not Eastern either. Margaret approached the desk. "I'm looking for Mr. Ingram." The man straightened, revealing his considerable height. "You found him. Walter Ingram, at your service." He offered a slight bow that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "Margaret Price," she replied. "Mr. Peterson at the general store said you might be hiring." Walter Ingram's gaze moved from Margaret to the children, who had clustered behind their mother. "You're looking for work?" "Yes, sir. I can cook, clean, so whatever you need." His expression remained unreadable. "And the children? They're well behaved," Margaret answered quickly. "Eleanor helps with the younger ones. They won't be any trouble." Walter stepped out from behind the desk, and Margaret noticed he wore a gun belt with an ease that suggested familiarity. Not a businessman, then, or at least not always. His clothes were fine but practical, and despite the formal setting, there was something unmistakably frontier about him. "Mrs. Price, Miss," she corrected automatically, then flushed. "It's Miss Price." Something flickered in his eyes. "Miss Price. I do need help. The hotel opens to guests next week, and I'm short-handed, but I need someone reliable, someone who can commit." "I'm reliable," Margaret insisted. "And I need this job, Mr. Ingram. My children and I." She trailed off, unwilling to play on his sympathy but desperate enough to consider it. Walter crouched down until he was eye-level with James. "What's your name, young man?" "James, sir," the boy answered, standing a little straighter. "Do you know how to polish boots, James?" The boy nodded earnestly. "Yes, sir. I polished my pa's boots every Sunday." A shadow crossed Walter's face. "Did you now?" He straightened and looked at Margaret. "There's a small cabin behind the hotel. It's not much, but it's clean. You can stay there while you work here. Room and board for you and the children, plus wages." Margaret blinked, taken aback by the sudden offer. "That's very generous, Mr. Ingram." "It's practical," he corrected her. "I need good help, and you need a place to stay. We can work out the details later." He gestured toward a door at the back of the lobby. "Through there, across the yard. Get settled, and we'll talk terms tomorrow morning." It wasn't until they were halfway across the yard that Margaret realized she'd been holding her breath. The cabin was indeed small, just 2 rooms, but it was sturdy and clean, with real glass windows and a stone fireplace. A far cry from the drafty shack they'd left behind. "Is this our new home, Mama?" Charlotte asked, her small hand tucked in Margaret's. "For now," Margaret answered cautiously. She'd learned not to promise permanence, not to believe in it herself. That night, with the children asleep on the two narrow beds, Margaret sat by the window, watching the lights of the hotel. Walter Ingram puzzled her. His generosity seemed genuine, but experience had taught her that men always wanted something in return. The question was what, and whether the price would be one she was willing to pay. The next morning, Margaret rose before dawn, dressed in her cleanest dress, and pinned her chestnut hair into a neat bun. After setting out breakfast for the children and instructing Alina to mind her siblings, she crossed the yard to the hotel's back entrance. The kitchen was already bustling with activity. A plump woman with gray-streaked hair looked up from a large pot of bubbling oatmeal. "You must be Miss Price," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Ingram said you'd be starting today. I'm Mrs. Hathaway, the cook." "Pleased to meet you," Margaret replied, relieved to find another woman in the kitchen. "Where would you like me to start?" Mrs. Hathaway gestured to a pile of linens. "Those need to be pressed for the rooms upstairs. Once you're done with that, we'll see about getting the dining room ready for breakfast." Margaret set to work, grateful for the familiar tasks. The hours passed quickly, and by midday, she had pressed the linens, helped serve breakfast to the workmen finishing the hotel, and begun cleaning the guest rooms on the second floor. She was dusting a mahogany dresser when a reflection in the mirror caught her attention. Walter Ingram stood in the doorway, watching her with those keen blue eyes. "Mr. Ingram," she acknowledged, turning to face him. "Is everything satisfactory?" "More than satisfactory, Miss Price. Mrs. Hathaway speaks highly of your work, and she's not easily impressed." He stepped into the room, his tall frame filling the space. "I wanted to check on you, see how you're settling in." "The cabin is perfect, thank you. The children are comfortable." Walter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And you, are you comfortable, Miss Price?" There was something in his tone that made Margaret study him more carefully. He was handsome in a rugged way, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of smiles rather than frowns. She guessed him to be in his mid-30s, perhaps a decade older than her own 26 years. "I'm grateful for the work," she answered carefully. "That's not what I asked," he replied, but his voice remained gentle. "Your children, they're quite different from each other. The oldest girl has your eyes, but the boys—" Margaret stiffened. "Is that a problem, Mr. Ingram?" "Not at all." He raised a hand in a placating gesture. "I'm just curious about your story, Miss Price. It's not easy for a woman alone on the frontier." "No," Margaret agreed, resuming her dusting with perhaps more vigor than necessary. "It's not, but we manage." Walter watched her for a moment longer. "Yes, I can see that you do. Dinner is served in the kitchen at 6. Your children are welcome to join us." With that, he left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Margaret released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Walter Ingram was observant, too observant for comfort. Her past was her own, and she preferred to keep it that way. The days fell into a pattern. Margaret worked from dawn until dusk, cleaning rooms, helping Mrs. Hathaway in the kitchen, and occasionally assisting with the ledgers when Walter discovered she could read and write. The hotel officially opened, bringing a steady stream of travelers through Tulsa. The children adapted to their new surroundings with the resilience of youth. Alina helped in the kitchen. James took to running errands for Walter. Charlotte charmed the guests with her sunny disposition. And little Thomas toddled after Mrs. Hathaway, who spoiled him shamelessly with cookie scraps. Margaret observed it all with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. They had food, shelter, and safety more than they'd had in years. But prosperity bred complacency, and complacency led to vulnerability. She'd learned that lesson 4 times over. It was nearly 3 weeks after they'd arrived in Tulsa when Margaret's fears materialized in the form of 3 dusty riders who arrived at the hotel late one afternoon. From the window of the room she was cleaning, she watched them dismount, their movements setting off warnings in her mind. She recognized the swagger, the casual arrogance, the same kind Samuel's killers had displayed. Margaret set down her cleaning cloth and hurried downstairs, her heart pounding. She found Walter in the lobby, greeting the newcomers with the same professional courtesy he showed all guests. "Rooms for the night, gentlemen," he was asking as Margaret slipped behind the desk. The tallest of the 3 men, a sandy-haired fellow with a pockmarked face, nodded. "2 rooms. Me and Garrett will take one. Davis here can have his own." He tossed a coin pouch onto the counter. "That cover it?" Walter counted out the coins. "It does indeed, Mr. Jenkins, Ben Jenkins." The name meant nothing to Margaret, but the gun on the man's hip spoke volumes. These were not ordinary travelers. Walter handed them keys. "Rooms 4 and 5, top of the stairs. Dinner's served at 6 in the dining room." The men trudged up the stairs, trailing dust and the faint smell of whiskey. When they were out of earshot, Margaret touched Walter's arm. "Those men," she whispered. "I don't like the look of them." Walter's expression remained neutral, but his voice lowered. "Neither do I, but they're paying customers and I can't turn them away without cause." "You're armed," Margaret observed, nodding toward the gun he wore even while managing the hotel. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. "Most men in these parts are armed, Miss Price." "Not like you," she countered. "You wear that gun like a man who knows how to use it." Walter studied her for a long moment. "There's a story there, I think." Margaret withdrew her hand from his arm. "There always is, Mr. Ingram." That evening, Margaret kept the children close, serving dinner in their cabin rather than joining the others in the kitchen, as had become their custom. Through the window, she watched the 3 men enter the dining room, their laughter carrying across the yard. A knock at the door made her jump. Eleanor looked up from helping Charlotte with her dinner. "Should I get it, Mama?" "No," Margaret replied, reaching for the small revolver she kept hidden in a drawer. "Stay at the table." She approached the door cautiously, concealing the gun in the folds of her skirt before opening it a crack. Walter stood on the porch, his broad shoulders blocking the view of the hotel. "Mr. Ingram," she said, relaxing slightly. "What can I do for you?" His eyes dropped to where her hand disappeared in her skirt, and his expression tightened. "May I come in, Miss Price?" Margaret hesitated, then stepped back, opening the door wider. Walter entered, removing his hat as he did so, nodding to the children who watched him curiously. "Good evening," he greeted them. "I missed you all at dinner." "We're having dinner here tonight," James announced proudly. "Mama made stew." Walter smiled at the boy. "It smells delicious." He turned back to Margaret, his voice dropping. "I came to check on you. You seemed concerned about our new guests." Margaret glanced at the children, then gestured for Walter to follow her to the far corner of the room. "Those men," she said quietly. "They remind me of the ones who killed Samuel Thomas's father." Walter's eyes widened slightly. "You believe they're the same men?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted, "but they have the same look about them. Dangerous. Reckless." "Many men out here fit that description," Walter pointed out gently. Margaret met his gaze directly. "3 weeks ago, one of them came to our homestead. I recognized him as one of the gang that killed Samuel. He thought I was alone. He was wrong." Her hand tightened around the revolver. "That's why we came to Tulsa." Understanding dawned in Walter's eyes. "You're running." "Surviving," Margaret corrected him. "There's a difference." Walter was silent for a moment, his gaze traveling over the small cabin, the 4 children at the table, and finally back to Margaret. "Keep your door locked tonight," he said at last. "I'll keep an eye on our guests." As he turned to leave, Margaret caught his arm. Mr. Ingram, Walter, those men, they're not just passing through. Men like that never are. Walter placed his hand over hers. I know, Margaret, trust me, I know. After he left, Margaret locked the door and pushed a chair against it for good measure. The children watched her with wide eyes as she checked the windows. Is something wrong, Mama? Eleanor asked, her young face too serious for her years. Margaret forced a smile. Nothing's wrong, sweetheart. Just being careful. She didn't sleep that night, sitting instead by the window with her revolver, watching the hotel. Occasionally, she glimpsed a shadow passing behind a lit window. Walter making his rounds. His vigilance should have comforted her, but instead, it only heightened her unease. Walter Ingram knew too much about dangerous men to be an ordinary hotelier. The next morning dawned clear and bright, at odds with Margaret's dark thoughts. She dressed the children and walked them to the kitchen, where Mrs. Hathaway greeted them with warm biscuits and a concerned frown. You look like you haven't slept a wink, the older woman observed, handing Margaret a cup of strong coffee. Just a restless night, Margaret replied, scanning the kitchen. Is Mr. Ingram about? Mrs. Hathaway nodded toward the dining room. Having breakfast with those new fellows. Strange bunch, if you ask me. Been asking all sorts of questions about the town, who lives where. Margaret's stomach clenched. What kind of questions? Oh, this and that. Whether any newcomers have arrived lately, particularly women traveling alone with children. Mrs. Hathaway's eyes narrowed. I didn't like the sound of it, so I played dumb. Said the only newcomer was Mr. Ingram himself. Thank you, Margaret whispered, touching the older woman's hand gratefully. Trouble follows you, doesn't it, girl? Mrs. Hathaway said, but her tone was kind. Well, you're not alone anymore. Remember that. Margaret wanted to believe her, but experience had taught her otherwise. She settled the children with breakfast and slipped into the dining room where Walter sat with the three men, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. Ah, Miss Price, he called when he spotted her. Just the person I needed. Could you bring the ledger from my office? These gentlemen are interested in staying a few more days. Margaret nodded, recognizing the request for what it was, an excuse to speak privately. In Walter's office, a small room off the lobby, she waited anxiously until he joined her a few minutes later. They're looking for you, he said without preamble, closing the door behind him. Didn't say as much, but the description matches. Woman with 4 children, recently left a homestead east of here. Margaret's hand went to her throat. Did you tell them anything? Of course not, Walter replied, frowning. But Tulsa's a small town. Someone else might. We need to leave, Margaret said, her mind already calculating what they would need, how far they could get. And go where? Walter challenged. They'd follow. Men like that don't give up easily. I know that better than most, she shot back. Walter's expression softened. Margaret, I can help you, but you need to trust me. Tell me everything. Margaret hesitated. Trust had been her downfall too many times, but Walter had shown her nothing but kindness, and now he was risking himself by hiding her presence from dangerous men. Samuel was a good man, she began slowly. Not like the others. Eleanor's father abandoned us when he learned I was expecting. James's father died of fever, and Charlotte's was killed in a bar fight before she was even born. She took a deep breath. Samuel was different. He wanted to marry me, give the children his name. But 3 months ago, he went to town for supplies and never returned. The next day, a traveler brought word that he'd been killed in a robbery gone wrong. Walter listened without interruption, his blue eyes steady on her face. 3 weeks ago, one of the men who killed him showed up at our door, Margaret continued. He recognized me from a description Samuel had given while bragging about his pretty wife to be at the saloon. The man thought I might have something valuable, something Samuel had mentioned. Did Samuel have something they wanted? Walter asked. Margaret shook her head. Nothing but dreams, but the man wouldn't believe me. He threatened the children, her voice hardened. So I shot him. Walter's eyebrows rose, but he didn't look shocked. You killed him? No. Wounded him enough to send him running. But I knew they'd come back, so we left that night. Walter was silent for a long moment, processing her story. These men, he said finally, they're not just passing outlaws, are they? I don't think so, Margaret admitted. From what the wounded one said, they're part of the Blackwater gang. They've been terrorizing homesteaders across the territory. Recognition flashed in Walter's eyes. The Blackwater gang, he repeated, his voice taking on a different tone, harder, colder. I've heard of them. We need to leave Tulsa, Margaret insisted. Tonight, while they're sleeping. Walter shook his head. Running won't solve this, Margaret. They'll keep coming. Then what do you suggest? She demanded, frustration edging her voice. I have 4 children to protect, Mr. Ingram. I won't put them at risk. Walter stepped closer, his height forcing Margaret to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. Let me handle this, he said, his voice low and intense. I know how to deal with men like these. How? Margaret challenged. You're a hotel owner. A smile touched Walter's lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. I wasn't always a hotel owner, Margaret. There was a time when men like these knew my name, and it gave them pause. Before she could question him further, the door to the office opened, and Mrs. Hathaway appeared, her face tight with worry. Those men, she hissed. They're asking the blacksmith about a woman with 4 young uns who might have come through recently. Old Ferguson's too loose-lipped for his own good. He's bound to mention you. Walter's expression hardened. Margaret, take the children and go to Sheriff Morris. Tell him I sent you and that I need him at the hotel. Mrs. Hathaway, if those men return before I find them, stall them. What are you going to do? Margaret asked, suddenly afraid for this man who had shown her more kindness in 3 weeks than she'd known in years. Walter's hand moved to rest on his gun. What needs to be done? Margaret hurried back to the kitchen, gathering the children with a forced calm she didn't feel. We're going for a walk, she announced, ignoring their confused protests. Right now. They were halfway down the main street when the sound of raised voices drew her attention to the blacksmith shop. The 3 men stood outside, the tallest Jenkins gesturing angrily while Ferguson shook his head. Margaret pushed the children into the shadow of a nearby building. Stay here, she whispered. Don't move, don't make a sound. Mama, Eleanor's frightened voice nearly broke Margaret's resolve. It's all right, she assured her daughter. I just need to see what's happening. James, watch Thomas. Margaret edged closer to the blacksmith shop, straining to hear the conversation. Told you, ain't seen no woman like that, Ferguson was saying, though his shifty eyes betrayed him. You're lying, old man, Jenkins growled. Word is she's working at that new hotel. Now, I'm only asking once more. He's already answered your question. Walter's voice rang out as he approached from the direction of the hotel. Perhaps you gentlemen would like to direct your inquiries to me instead. Margaret's breath caught as Walter walked calmly toward the 3 men, his posture relaxed but alert. Jenkins turned, hand hovering near his gun. This doesn't concern you, hotelier, he sneered. I disagree, Walter replied evenly. You're asking about one of my employees. That makes it very much my concern. The 3 outlaws exchanged glances. So she is here, the one called Garrett said, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. Told you, Ben. Miss Price works for me, Walter confirmed, his gaze steady. Along with several other women. Is there a particular reason you're looking for her? Jenkins stepped forward. She has something that belongs to us, something her man took before we killed him. A chill ran down Margaret's spine. This confirmed what she'd feared. These were Samuel's killers. I think you're mistaken, Walter said, his voice dangerously soft. Miss Price is a widow with 4 children to support. She owns nothing of value except her good name, which, I might add, you're currently threatening." "Look, mister," Jenkins snarled, "I don't know who you think you are, but you'd best step aside. This ain't your fight." Walter's hand moved to his gun belt, not drawing but making his intention clear. "That's where you're wrong. Now, I suggest you gentlemen collect your belongings from my hotel and move on. Tulsa doesn't welcome the Blackwater gang." At the mention of the gang's name, the 3 men stiffened. The one called Davis narrowed his eyes. "How do you know who we are?" "I make it my business to know," Walter replied. "Just as Territorial Marshal William Parker makes it his business." Jenkins paled visibly. "Parker, the wolf." "The same," Walter confirmed. "He's particularly interested in the Blackwater gang after that family you killed outside Fort Smith last month." "You're bluffing," Garrett hissed, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Walter raised an eyebrow. "Sheriff Morris should be arriving any minute." "Why don't you wait and see?" As if on cue, a man wearing a sheriff's badge rounded the corner, shotgun in hand. "Everything all right, Walter?" he called. "Just fine, Morris," Walter answered without taking his eyes off the outlaws. "These gentlemen were just leaving town." For a tense moment, Margaret thought Jenkins might draw his gun. His hand twitched and Walter's body tensed imperceptibly. Then, with a muttered curse, Jenkins backed down. "This ain't over," he warned, pointing at Walter. "You made a mistake today getting involved in this." "No," Walter replied calmly. "You made the mistake when you killed an innocent man and then threatened his family. Now get out of my town." The 3 men retreated, mounting their horses and riding out of Tulsa at a gallop. Only when they were out of sight did Walter turn, his gaze finding Margaret in her hiding place. "They'll be back," he said quietly as he approached her, "with more men." Margaret stepped out of the shadows, the children clinging to her skirts. "How did you know those things about them?" "About the marshal." Walter glanced at the sheriff, who had come to stand beside them. "Because William Parker isn't just a marshal," he said. "He was my partner for 7 years before I retired. They call him the Wolf because he never gives up a hunt." "And they called you the Eagle," Sheriff Morris added with a wry smile, "because you could spot trouble a mile away and strike before anyone knew what hit them." Margaret stared at Walter, seeing him in a new light. "You were a marshal." "Until 2 years ago," Walter confirmed. "When I decided I'd seen enough killing to last a lifetime." "Yet you still wear a gun," Margaret observed. Walter's eyes met hers. "Some habits are hard to break, and sometimes they come in handy." Back at the hotel, with the children safely ensconced in Mrs. Hathaway's care in the kitchen, Margaret and Walter sat in his office, a bottle of whiskey between them. "You should have told me," Margaret said, her untouched glass cradled between her palms. "About being a marshal," Walter shrugged. "It's not something I advertise. Most people prefer their hoteliers without a violent past." "It might have saved us some trouble if I'd known," Margaret pointed out. "I wouldn't have been so afraid to tell you about Samuel and the Blackwater gang." "Would you have believed me?" Walter asked. "Or would you have thought I was making up stories to gain your trust?" Margaret considered this. "I don't trust easily, it's true." "With good reason," Walter acknowledged. 4 children, 4 fathers all gone. That's a heavy burden for anyone to bear, let alone a young woman on the frontier. "I've managed," Margaret said, lifting her chin. Walter's expression softened. "Yes, you have. Admirably so. Your children are a testament to that well-mannered, resilient kind. You've done right by them, Margaret." His praise warmed her in a way the whiskey could not. "What happens now?" she asked. "You said they'll return." "They will," Walter confirmed grimly. "The Blackwater gang doesn't forgive or forget, but neither does William Parker." He leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. "I sent a telegram this afternoon. Will's in Oklahoma City, just 2 days' ride from here. He'll come. And until then, Margaret pressed, my children are in danger every moment those men are free. Walter drained his glass. Until then, we prepare. Tulsa's a small town, but its people stick together. Morris is deputizing men as we speak. The hotel will be guarded day and night. I can't ask that of you, Margaret protested. This is my fight, not yours or the town's. You didn't ask, Walter replied simply. I offered. And as for the town, well, Tulsa's been looking for a reason to stand against the Blackwater gang for some time. They've terrorized homesteaders across the territory for too long. Margaret studied him, this complex man who had appeared in her life when she needed him most. Why are you doing this, Walter? Truly? Walter was silent for a long moment, turning his empty glass in his hands. When I first saw you, he said finally, standing in my lobby with 4 children and nothing but determination to keep you going, I recognized something in you. The same thing that kept me going during the darkest days as a marshal, the will to protect what matters, no matter the cost. He set the glass down and met her gaze directly. I left the marshal service because I was tired of seeing good people suffer while I arrived too late to help them. When I built this hotel, I thought I was leaving that life behind. But then you arrived, and I realized some fights are worth joining, even when they aren't yours to begin with. Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. My children are extraordinary, Walter finished for her. Each one of them. And they deserve a chance at a life without fear, without running. And what about you? Margaret asked softly. What do you deserve, Walter Ingram? A smile touched his lips. Peace, I suppose, though it seems that's still a ways off. The next day passed in tense anticipation. Walter organized the town's defense with the efficiency of a man accustomed to command. Barricades were erected at the main approaches to Tulsa, lookouts posted, and the hotel fortified. Margaret kept the children close, explaining in simple terms that bad men might come, but that Walter and the townspeople would protect them. The children, with the remarkable adaptability of youth, accepted this latest disruption to their lives with minimal complaint. It was Alina who surprised Margaret most, approaching Walter as he checked the hotel's defenses late that afternoon. Mr. Ingram, the 10-year-old said solemnly, are you going to be our new papa? Walter froze, his expression one of complete shock. Margaret, who had been folding linens nearby, nearly dropped the sheet she was holding. Alina, she gasped. That's not, you shouldn't. Walter recovered first, crouching down to the girl's level. What makes you ask that, Alina? The child shrugged with the blunt honesty of youth. You take care of us like a papa should. James said his papa never did that, and Charlotte doesn't remember hers at all. Thomas's papa tried, but he died. You're not dead, and you're helping us. Margaret felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment, but Walter didn't seem flustered by the child's logic. Taking care of people you care about is what adults do, he explained gently. It doesn't always mean they become family. Alina considered this. But you could be our papa if you wanted to, couldn't you? Walter's eyes flickered to Margaret, who stood frozen in mortification. That's a complicated question, Alina, he said carefully, and one that your mother and I would need to discuss privately. Because you have to get married first, Alina nodded sagely. I know that part. Alina, Margaret finally found her voice. That's quite enough. Go help Mrs. Hathaway with dinner, please. The girl sighed dramatically but obeyed, leaving Margaret and Walter in an awkward silence. I'm so sorry, Margaret began. Children say the most inappropriate. She's observant, Walter interrupted, rising to his full height. Like her mother. Margaret busied herself with the linens, unable to meet his gaze. Still, it was presumptuous and completely Margaret. Walter's hand came to rest on hers, stilling her nervous folding. Look at me. Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to his. Elena asked a fair question, he said softly, one I've been considering myself. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Walter, you barely know me. I know enough, he replied. I know you're brave, resourceful, and fiercely protective of your children. I know you've had more than your share of hardship, yet you've remained kind and honorable. What more do I need to know? My past, she began. Is just that past, Walter finished. I'm more interested in the future. Yours, the children's, and perhaps ours. Before Margaret could respond, a shout from outside broke the moment. Walter was instantly alert, moving to the window. Riders, he said grimly. At least a dozen. The Blackwater gang has returned. Margaret's chest tightened with fear, but it was different now, not the desperate terror of a woman alone, but the controlled fear of someone with allies, with hope. What do we do? She asked. Walter turned from the window, his expression resolute. We fight. The next hours were a blur of activity. The townspeople took up positions according to Walter's plan. Women and children were gathered in the sturdy stone building that housed the bank, the most defensible structure in town. Margaret, despite Walter's protests, refused to join them. I can shoot, she reminded him, checking the revolver she had carried since Samuel's death. And they're here because of me. I won't hide while others fight my battle. Walter looked like he wanted to argue, but instead handed her extra ammunition. Stay in the hotel, he instructed. Second floor corner room, you'll have a good view of the main street, but be protected from return fire. As dusk fell, the Blackwater gang made their move. They charged into town with guns blazing, clearly expecting to overwhelm the small community through sheer force and intimidation. Instead, they rode into a carefully prepared ambush. Gunfire erupted from all sides as Tulsa's defenders opened fire from their concealed positions. 2 outlaws fell immediately, and the others scattered, seeking cover. From her position at the hotel window, Margaret tracked Jenkins, the leader who had threatened her family. He dismounted behind a water trough, returning fire toward the sheriff's office. We know you're here, woman, he shouted during a lull in the shooting. Send her out and the rest of you can live. That's not happening, Jenkins. Walter's voice rang out from his position near the hotel's entrance. Surrender now, or none of you will leave Tulsa alive. The gunfight resumed with renewed intensity. Margaret held her fire, waiting for a clear shot at Jenkins. Her hands were steady, her breath controlled. Samuel had taught her to shoot, insisting that every frontier woman should know how to defend herself. The irony that she now used those skills against his killers was not lost on her. A movement to her left caught her attention. One of the outlaws was climbing the hotel's exterior stairs, attempting to flank Walter's position. Without hesitation, Margaret swung her revolver and fired. The man cried out, clutching his shoulder as he tumbled back down the stairs. The shot revealed her position. Bullets splintered the window frame, forcing her to duck below the sill. When she risked a glance outside again, she saw Jenkins making a run toward the hotel, determination etched on his face. Walter. She cried in warning, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of gunfire. Margaret took aim and fired, but missed as Jenkins disappeared beneath the hotel's overhang. Panic rose in her throat as she realized he was now inside the building, potentially making his way toward her. The floorboards in the hallway creaked. Margaret positioned herself beside the door, revolver raised. When the door burst open, she fired without hesitation, only to find herself facing Walter. God's mercy, she gasped, lowering the gun with shaking hands. I nearly killed you. Jenkins is inside, Walter said, seemingly unfazed by his near miss. We need to. A shot rang out from the direction of the stairwell. Walter pushed Margaret behind him as Jenkins appeared in the doorway, his gun smoking. Found you, the outlaw sneered, his gaze fixed on Margaret. Thought you could hide behind your new protector, did you? It's over, Jenkins, Walter said calmly, though Margaret could feel the tension in his body. Your men are either dead or captured. Marshal Parker will be here by morning. Jenkins laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. Then I've got nothing to lose, have I? His gun swung toward Walter. Step aside. The woman's mine. That's not going to happen, Walter replied. You want her, you go through me. Gladly, Jenkins snarled and fired. Walter dove to the side, drawing and firing in one fluid motion. His bullet caught Jenkins in the chest, sending the outlaw staggering backward. But Jenkins wasn't finished. He raised his gun again, aiming not at Walter but at Margaret. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. Margaret felt the burn of a bullet grazing her arm, but her own shot found its mark. Jenkins collapsed, a look of surprise frozen on his face as life left his eyes. The sudden silence was deafening. Outside, the gunfire had ceased. Walter moved to the window, peering cautiously into the darkening street. It's over, he announced, turning back to Margaret. The gang is finished. Margaret lowered her revolver, the reality of what had just occurred washing over her. I killed him, she whispered. Walter approached her, gently taking the gun from her trembling hands. You defended yourself and your children, he corrected her. There's no shame in that. My arm, Margaret said, suddenly aware of the warm wetness seeping through her sleeve. Walter examined the wound, his touch careful. Just a graze. Let's get you downstairs to Doc Turner. As they descended the stairs, the hotel lobby came into view. Several townspeople had gathered, their faces lighting with relief at the sight of Walter. We got 'em all, Walter, Sheriff Morris announced proudly. 3 dead, the rest in custody. Good work, Morris, Walter replied. Miss Price needs the doctor bullet graze. As Doc Turner tended to her arm, Margaret's thoughts turned to her children, still sheltered in the bank with the other townswomen and children. The children, she said, trying to rise. I need to, they're fine, Mrs. Hathaway assured her, appearing at the doctor's side. I checked on them myself not 5 minutes ago. That Alina of yours is quite the little mother, keeping the others calm with stories. Relief washed over Margaret. Thank you, she whispered, sinking back into her chair. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the peaceful sunrise at odds with the previous night's violence. Margaret stood on the hotel porch, her bandaged arm in a sling, watching as a tall, lean man rode into town. Walter joined her, his presence a steady comfort at her side. That's Will, he said, nodding toward the approaching rider. Right on time, as usual. Marshal William Parker dismounted in front of the hotel, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile at the sight of Walter. Heard you had some excitement, he drawled, climbing the porch steps. Couldn't stay out of trouble even after hanging up your badge, could you, Walt? Walter chuckled, clasping the marshal's hand. Trouble found me this time, Will. Or rather, his gaze shifted to Margaret, it found Miss Price here. William Parker tipped his hat to Margaret. Madam, understand you've had a rough time of it. The Blackwater gang won't be bothering anyone anymore, Margaret replied. Thanks to Mr. Ingram and the people of Tulsa. The marshal raised an eyebrow at Walter. Mr. Ingram, is it now? Getting formal in your old age, Eagle. Walter cleared his throat. Will, why don't we discuss the prisoners inside? As the men talked business, Margaret made her way to the cabin behind the hotel where her children waited. They rushed to greet her, their faces alight with excitement. Mama. Everyone's saying you and Mr. Ingram are heroes, James exclaimed, bouncing on his toes. Did you really shoot a bad man, Mama? Charlotte asked, her eyes wide. Margaret gathered them close, mindful of her injured arm. What happened last night isn't something to celebrate, she said gently. Men died, and that's always a sad thing, even when they're bad men. Alina, perceptive as always, studied her mother's face. "But we're safe now, aren't we? We don't have to leave," the question gave Margaret pause. With the Blackwater gang defeated, the immediate danger had passed. But what of the future? Would Tulsa truly be their home, or was it just another temporary stop in their journey? The answer came later that day, as Margaret sat on the cabin's porch watching the children play in the yard. Walter approached, having seen Marshall Parker off with the surviving gang members. "May I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. Margaret nodded, suddenly nervous without knowing why. Walter settled beside her, his gaze following the children's antics. "They're resilient," he observed, already putting last night behind them. "Children adapt," Margaret replied. "Sometimes I think too well. They've seen more hardship in their short lives than anyone should." Walter was quiet for a moment. "What will you do now, Margaret, with the danger past?" It was the question she'd been asking herself all day. "I don't know," she admitted. "The hotel job is good and the children seem settled here, but you're waiting for the next disaster," Walter finished for her. "The next time you'll have to pack up and run." Margaret looked at him in surprise. "How did you know?" "Because I lived that way for years as a marshal," he explained. "Always waiting for the next gunfight, the next outlaw. It's no way to live, Margaret, and it's certainly no way for children to grow up." "What's the alternative?" she asked quietly. "I'm a woman alone with 4 children. The frontier isn't kind to people like me." Walter turned to face her fully. "You don't have to be alone." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Walter, let me finish," he said gently. "I've been alone too long. Building this hotel, I thought I was creating a new life for myself, but it was empty. Then you and the children arrived, and suddenly there was life here, real life, with all its complications and joys." He took her hand in his. "I'm not proposing out of pity or obligation, Margaret. I'm proposing because I've come to care for you and your children deeply. Alina asked if I could be their father. I'd like the chance to try if you'll have me." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "The children are wonderful," Walter assured her. "Each one of them. Alina with her serious nature, James with his eagerness to please, Charlotte with her endless questions, and little Thomas with his mischievous smile. They're not a burden, Margaret. They're a gift." "4 children with 4 different fathers," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All dead. What makes you think you'll fare any better?" Walter smiled, a warmth in his eyes that made Margaret's breath catch. "Well, for one thing, I'm considerably harder to kill than most." His expression grew serious. "And I've spent years bringing men to justice. I know how to protect what's mine." "Is that what we would be?" Margaret asked. "Yours?" Walter's hand tightened around hers. "Mine to cherish, to protect, to love, just as I would be yours." Margaret looked out at the children playing in the yard, her children, who had known so much loss and uncertainty. Could she risk believing in a future with this man? Could she trust that this time would be different? As if sensing her thoughts, Walter released her hand and stood. "I don't expect an answer today, Margaret. Take the time you need. I'll be here when you decide." He walked toward the children, who greeted him with enthusiastic shouts. James immediately began showing him a stick he'd whittled into something resembling a horse, while Charlotte tugged at his hand, demanding a piggyback ride. Alina watched with a small smile, and Thomas toddled over, arms raised in the universal request to be picked up. Walter obliged, swinging the toddler onto his shoulders with practiced ease. His laughter mingled with the children's, carrying across the yard to where Margaret sat. In that moment, something shifted within her, a loosening of the protective shell she'd built around her heart. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included not just survival, but happiness. The following weeks passed in a pleasant rhythm. Margaret continued her work at the hotel, which grew busier as Tulsa's reputation as a safe, well-managed town spread. Walter expanded his business, adding a small restaurant that quickly became popular with travelers and townspeople alike. The children flourished under the stability of their new life. Elena helped in the restaurant after school, showing a natural talent for organization that impressed even the most demanding customers. James became Walter's shadow, learning the basics of carpentry as Walter made improvements to the hotel. Charlotte charmed the guests with her precocious questions, while Thomas, now approaching his 3rd birthday, toddled confidently around the hotel, considering it his personal kingdom. Through it all, Walter was patient, never pressuring Margaret for an answer to his proposal. But his actions spoke volumes the way he included the children in his daily activities, the respect he showed Margaret's independence, the quiet support he offered when memories of the past threatened to overwhelm her. It was a cool autumn evening when Margaret finally made her decision. The children were asleep, and she sat on the hotel porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Walter joined her, offering a cup of coffee which she accepted gratefully. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling into the chair beside her. Margaret smiled. "They're worth considerably more than that, Mr. Ingram," Walter chuckled. "Is that so? Well, I'm a man of means these days. Name your price." "A lifetime," Margaret replied softly. "That's my price." Walter went still, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "Margaret." She turned to face him, her heart pounding but her mind clear. "Yes, Walter. My answer is yes." The joy that transformed his face was worth every moment of doubt, every fear she'd overcome to reach this point. "You're certain?" he asked, setting aside his cup and taking her hands in his. "I don't want you to feel obligated because of what happened with the Blackwater gang, or because the children have grown attached to me." Margaret shook her head. "This isn't about obligation, Walter. It's about choice, my choice. For the first time in years, I'm choosing a path not out of necessity or fear, but because it's what I want, what we all want." Walter's thumbs traced circles on her palms. "And what is it you want, Margaret Price?" "A home," she answered simply. "A partner. A future where my children can grow up without fear." And she added with a smile, "A husband who looks at me the way you do." "And how is that?" Walter asked, his voice husky. "Like I'm a treasure you've been searching for your entire life." Walter leaned forward, his forehead touching hers. "You are," he whispered. "You and those 4 remarkable children." Their wedding took place on a crisp December morning, the hotel decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons for the Christmas season. The entire town turned out for the celebration, filling the dining room to capacity as Judge Hamilton performed the ceremony. Elena stood proudly as Margaret's maid of honor, while James took his role as ring bearer with solemn dignity. Charlotte scattered flower petals with enthusiastic abandon, and Thomas, held by Mrs. Hathaway, watched the proceedings with wide-eyed fascination. As Margaret and Walter exchanged vows, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. This was no desperate gamble, no compromise made for survival. This was a choice, freely made, between 2 people who had found in each other something worth fighting for. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Hamilton declared. "You may kiss your bride." Walter's kiss was gentle yet confident, a promise of all the days to come. When they parted, the assembled guests erupted in cheers and applause. At the reception that followed, Marshall Parker, who had returned for the wedding, raised a toast to the newlyweds. "To Walter and Margaret Ingram," he proclaimed, "and to the 4 young Ingrams who made this family complete before it even began." The children beamed at being included, though Elena corrected the marshal with typical precision. "We're still Prices," she pointed out. Walter hasn't adopted us yet. A hush fell over the gathering at the child's forthright statement. Walter crouched down to Aliner's level, his expression serious. "You're right, Aliner," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But if you'll have me, I'd like very much to be your father in name as well as deed. All of you," he added, looking at each child in turn. "Does that mean we'd be Ingrams?" James asked excitedly. Walter nodded. "It does, but only if that's what you want." "Yes," Charlotte exclaimed without hesitation. "I want to be Charlotte Ingram." James nodded vigorously. "Me too. I mean James Ingram, not Charlotte Ingram." Thomas, not entirely understanding but caught up in the excitement, clapped his hands and shouted, "Me too." All eyes turned to Aliner, who considered Walter with a seriousness beyond her years. "If we become Ingrams," she asked, "what happens to our real fathers? Will we forget them?" Walter's expression softened. "No, Aliner, your fathers will always be a part of you, no matter what name you carry. Becoming an Ingram doesn't erase who you were or where you came from. It just adds to your story." Aliner thought about this, then nodded decisively. "Then yes, I'd like to be Aliner Ingram." Margaret, watching this exchange with tears in her eyes, felt her heart might burst with love for this man, who understood so perfectly what her children needed to hear. Later that night, with the celebration concluded and the children asleep in their new rooms in the family quarters above the hotel, Margaret and Walter stood by the window of their bedroom, looking out at the moonlit streets of Tulsa. "Happy, Mrs. Ingram?" Walter asked, his arms encircling her waist from behind. Margaret leaned back against his chest. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she admitted. "A year ago, I was alone on a failing homestead, wondering how I would feed my children through the winter. Now look at us." "Life can change quickly," Walter agreed, "for better or worse." Margaret turned in his arms to face him. "Do you ever regret it? Hanging up your badge, settling in Tulsa, taking on a ready-made family?" Walter's hand came up to cup her cheek. "Not for a moment. I spent years chasing outlaws across the territory, and you know what I learned. Justice is important, vital even, but it's hollow without something to come home to." "And now," Margaret asked softly. "Now I have everything a man could want," Walter replied. "A beautiful wife, 4 extraordinary children, a business that prospers, and a town worth protecting. What more could I ask for?" Margaret smiled mischievously. "Perhaps a 5th child in time, one who begins as an Ingram." Walter's eyes widened, then crinkled with joy. "Is that a promise or a prediction, Mrs. Ingram?" "A hope," Margaret answered, stretching up to kiss him. "One of many for our future together." Spring came to Tulsa in a riot of wildflowers and new beginnings. The hotel expanded again, adding a second wing to accommodate the growing number of travelers as the railroad finally reached the town. Margaret's small restaurant became renowned throughout the territory for its excellent food and warm hospitality. The Ingram children thrived. Aliner, now 11, discovered a passion for books and learning that the town's schoolteacher enthusiastically nurtured. James developed a talent for woodworking under Walter's guidance, creating small furniture pieces that sold well to hotel guests. Charlotte's natural charm and curiosity made her a favorite with travelers, who often brought her small gifts from distant places. And Thomas, growing from toddler to little boy, shadowed his older siblings with determination, eager to be included in their adventures. By summer, Margaret's hope had become reality. She was expecting a child, due to arrive with the first snows of winter. The news was met with jubilation from Walter and varying degrees of excitement from the children. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" Charlotte demanded, eyeing her mother's still flat stomach with suspicion. "We won't know until the baby arrives," Margaret explained patiently. "I hope it's a boy," James declared. "Girls talk too much." Elena rolled her eyes at her brother. "It doesn't matter what it is, as long as it's healthy." "That's very sensible, Elena," Walter approved, winking at Margaret over the children's heads. As her pregnancy progressed, Margaret found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed. The woman who had once faced the frontier alone, armed with nothing but determination and a small revolver, now stood at the center of a thriving family and business. One evening in late October, as she and Walter sat on their private balcony watching the sunset, she voiced these thoughts. "Sometimes I can hardly believe this is my life," she admitted. "I spent so many years just surviving, Walter, just getting through each day, each crisis, each loss. I never dared to imagine a life like this." Walter took her hand, his thumb rubbing over the gold band he had placed there nearly a year before. "You deserved this all along, Margaret. A partner who stands beside you, not children who bear the burden of adult worries, a home that's truly safe." Margaret smiled, placing their joined hands over her rounded belly where their child grew. "I've been thinking about names," she said. "If it's a girl, I'd like to name her Hope." "Hope Ingram," Walter tested the name. "It's perfect, and if it's a boy," Margaret considered this. "Samuel," she said finally, "to honor the man who tried to be a father to all my children even though he never had the chance." Walter's expression softened with understanding. Samuel Ingram, a fine name for a boy. The baby arrived on a snowy December morning, a boy with Walter's blue eyes and a shock of dark hair like his mother's. Samuel William Ingram entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to his father's eyes and a tired smile to his mother's face. The older children crowded into the bedroom as soon as they were permitted, eager to meet their new brother. Elena approached the bed first, her young face solemn with the responsibility of oldest sister. "He's so small," she whispered, reaching out a finger which the baby promptly grasped. Her face lit with wonder. "Look, Mama, he's holding my finger. He knows his big sister," Walter said, his arm around Elena's shoulders. "He'll be counting on you to help watch over him." James peered at the baby cautiously. "He's all red and wrinkly." "All babies look like that at first," Margaret assured him with a laugh. "Even you did." "Did not," James protested, but he smiled at his new brother nonetheless. Charlotte climbed onto the bed for a closer look. "When can he play with us?" "Not for a while yet," Walter explained. "First he needs to grow a bit, learn to sit up, to crawl, to walk." "I can teach him," Thomas announced proudly. "I'm a good walker now." "Yes, you are," Margaret agreed, touching his cheek fondly, "and you'll be a wonderful big brother." As the children chattered excitedly about all the things they would teach baby Samuel, Margaret caught Walter's gaze across the bed. The love she saw there for her, for the children they shared, for the life they had built together, filled her with a contentment she had once thought beyond her reach. Later, when the older children had been shooed away and baby Samuel slept peacefully in the cradle Walter had crafted, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 4 children with 4 different fathers, all dead, she murmured, stroking Samuel's tiny hand. "That's how I came to Tulsa." Walter, seated beside her on the bed, raised an eyebrow, and now Margaret smiled up at him. Now 5 children with 1 father very much alive and loved beyond measure. Walter leaned down to kiss her, his hand gently cradling their son's head. "And I'll be the only father they'll ever need," he promised, echoing the words he had spoken on that day when Margaret had first revealed her story to him. As the snow fell softly outside their window, Margaret Ingram closed her eyes, secure in the knowledge that she had finally found her true home, not in a place, but in the hearts of the family she and Walter had forged together through courage, faith, and love. Years passed, and the Ingram family flourished alongside the growing town of Tulsa. The hotel expanded into one of the finest establishments in the territory, known for its comfort, excellent food, and the warm welcome extended by the family that ran it. Eleanor, at 18, became the first woman from Tulsa to attend college, traveling east to study literature with Walter's full support and Margaret's anxious pride. James, 16 and already showing a businessman's acumen, managed the hotel's accounts when not perfecting his carpentry. Charlotte, 13 and beautiful, charmed guests with her musical talents, while 11-year-old Thomas had developed into a natural horseman, often helping with the hotel's livery stable. And young Samuel, now 7, combined his father's steadiness with his mother's determination, already declaring his intention to become a lawman like Walter had once been. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Walter presented Margaret with a gift, the deed to a sprawling ranch just outside town, with a fine house overlooking the rolling plains. "The hotel was always my dream," he told her as they stood on the porch of their new home. "But this is for our family. Room to grow, to breathe, to put down roots that will last generations." Margaret leaned against his shoulder, watching their 5 children explore the grounds with whoops of excitement. "It's perfect, Walter. Absolutely perfect." That evening, with the children finally asleep in their new bedrooms, Margaret and Walter sat on the porch swing, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, a position as familiar and comfortable as their love for each other. "Did you ever imagine this?" Margaret asked softly. "When you first saw me in the hotel lobby, a desperate woman with 4 children and nowhere to go," Walter chuckled, the sound reverberating through his chest. "I imagined many things, my love, but the reality has surpassed them all." Margaret smiled, thinking of the long road that had brought her to this moment, the heartbreaks and losses, the struggles and fears, and finally, the joy and security she had found with the man beside her. Her 4 children had different fathers, all dead, she mused. "A cowboy said then, I'll be the only father they need. That was our beginning." Walter turned to her, his blue eyes still as clear and steady as the day they had met. "No," he corrected gently, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "That was just the opening chapter. Our story continues with every day we share, every challenge we face together, every joy we celebrate as a family." "And it's a good story, isn't it?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. Walter's kiss was gentle, familiar, and still filled with the passion that had sustained them through a decade of marriage. "The very best kind," he murmured against her lips. "A love story." As the stars emerged above their new home, Margaret Price Ingram closed her eyes and offered a silent prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here to this man, these children, this life full of promise and possibility. The past with its sorrows would always be a part of her, but it no longer defined her. Instead, she was defined by the love she had found and nurtured, by the family she and Walter had built together, and by the future they would continue to create, one day at a time.